Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your moderator, senior reporter for Southern California Public Radio, Ben Bergman.
Thank you so much for coming to our panel on minimum wage pains and gains. I want to briefly introduce our panel. We have Rusty Hicks, who is Executive Secretary-Treasurer of the LA County Federation of Labor. The Federation comprises more than 300 local unions that represents more than 600,000 workers in every sector of our economy. Thank you for joining us, Rusty. We also have, to my right, Russ Duvall. He is Chief Research Officer at the Milken Institute, our host here today, and he oversees research on economic growth and job creation, very apt topics for today. He also works on topics related to health. We also, to my left, have Roxana Tayyan. She's Executive Director of the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, known as LANE. She joined the group in 2001 and assumed the top position in 2012. Thank you for coming, Roxana. And finally, we have Ken Jacobs. He is chair of the Center for Labor Research and Education at the University of California, Berkeley. His areas of focus include low-wage work, labor standards policies, and healthcare coverage. Please welcome our panel today. So this panel is about the pains and the gains of providing a living wage for California residents. So I want to start with an overview of the gains that a $15 minimum wage will provide to California residents. And Ken, this is something you've looked at a lot. So I want you to tell our audience what sort of gains we're talking about, how much of a raise, and who specifically is going to get it.
Sure. So the California minimum wage will increase to $15 an hour by 2023. Slide 10. We estimate that overall, it's about 5.6 million workers will benefit from the California minimum wage increase. And if we add in the other about 800,000 workers who've benefited from local minimum wage increases, we're talking about 6.4 million workers overall. This is a very large impact in the state. Average increase in earnings, about $3,700 a person. So, and that means people who started out lower will, of course, get larger increases, and people who started out closer to the higher new wage will get smaller increases. And to note, these numbers include both people who are directly affected by the higher minimum wage and also people who are indirectly affected, because we expect some wage push as people who earn just a bit more than $15 or would have in 2023, their wages go up as well. In terms of we look at who those workers are, so slide 11, it's 96% of them are 20 or older. On average, they contribute half of their family income. These are bread earners. And this is an important discussion. We look at who are low-wage workers in California and in the United States as a whole. There's been a real shift over the last 20 years or so, where we've seen low-wage workers are older, they're more likely to have children, and they're higher educated than low-wage workers were in the past. Next slide, so that's slide 12. So in terms of education, nearly half, 47% of those workers have at least some college. So while the low-wage workers, the workers who receive a benefit from the wage increase are people who, they're disproportionately lower education than the workforce as a whole. A surprisingly large amount of them have some college or more.
So the myth that the only people who are making minimum wage are high school students, temporary workers, young people, is just that.
That's right. The sort of people have in their head that the idea of a minimum person who will benefit from a minimum wage increase is somebody in high school who's working at a fast food restaurant. They're right about the working at the fast food restaurant, but those workers are by and large not people, or in the vast majority aren't people who are in high school. They're people who are supporting themselves, supporting their families.
And just to put this into perspective, you actually looked at the change in real incomes that Californians get from 1979 until very recently. Show us that slide.
Sure. Let's get going back, so we got to grab the slide number here. So slide 8. And it's important to note all of this is happening in a context of both increased economic inequality in the state and nationally, and declining or stagnant real wages for people in the bottom 60% of the workforce. So what you can see here is going from the late 1970s, we saw the wages at the bottom 60% of the workforce went down. Now, if you brought that up, this is, the data is a couple of years out. If you brought it up to now, some of those red numbers would look a little bit better, especially in that bottom 10%, because we're now seeing some wage growth at the bottom. Part of that's due to the fact that the minimum wage went up from $8 to $10 over the last 2 years. Part of it's due to a tightening labor market. So we've had some improvement, but the real growth has been concentrated at the top. And to really put this in stark terms, if we go back to the mid-1970s, 20% of pre-tax income in the United States went to the bottom 50% of workers, and 10% went to the top 1%. That has now flipped, so that where we are now, the top 1% get about 20% of the pre-tax income in the United States, and the bottom 50% get about 10%. So when we look at sort of minimum wage is one part of addressing the challenge of increased inequality by raising that part at the bottom. Really affects about the bottom 30% in terms of what's being done here, which you can see that's where we've seen the most decline. So it is hitting the right part of the wage distribution. But it is one step, and there are other things that will also need to be done.
And we're going to talk about some of those other solutions a little bit later. But I also want to bring you in, Rusty, as one of the people who really led this movement that started in the city of LA, quickly moved to the county of LA, and then moved to the state level, all in a very short period of time. Why was it so important, do you think, to have a statewide $15 minimum wage?
Certainly the conversation around wage inequality and the challenges that workers had to provide for themselves and for their families really started with the voices of fast food workers on the national stage. And here in Los Angeles, it was hotel workers that really began to talk about wage inequality in the city. And so, wage increases have been seen in other parts of the state, in other parts of the country, where local jurisdictions stepped forward and did what was not happening on a statewide or on the national stage. And so certainly LA, the city of LA, was the beachhead in many ways, and I think tipped the scale to ultimately try to move to a statewide minimum wage. But we knew that LA couldn't be an island, right? You had to go to the county, you had to go to other cities. But ultimately, we always argued that it would be better to have a statewide minimum wage increase for nearly 6 million workers all across California. But that wasn't happening or had not been successful legislatively. There were some moves to try to ultimately go to the ballot. Obviously, those were withdrawn once we saw action through the legislative process and a signature by the governor.
Well, the governor, less than a year ago, was against the $15 minimum wage. He actually said that, he said, quote, raise the minimum wage too much and you put a lot of poor people out of work. He said that in January of this year. It's also been suggested by some that raising the wage to $15 for the whole state is economically reckless. Russ, do you want to weigh in on that? Was the governor right that raising the minimum wage too much and you'll put a lot of poor people out of work?
I don't think he was. Are you asking me? Or?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. It's.
I
Ross
do have an
versus
opinion on this.
Well, I'm sure. I suspect you do. Now, I feel it's somewhat perhaps of a disadvantage, in that I'm supposed to represent the business community voice, but I also represent my own voice. I think the governor's statement was a bit of hyperbole to some extent, but to suggest that there won't be real consequences, I think, is not being fair. So I'm not against raising the minimum wage. I think we need to have a wage floor. It was too low. It needed to be raised. But I think we have to be honest and really investigate the issue of, does it make sense to have a unified minimum wage around the state? And here's where I would say it doesn't. So if you look at slide 1, it compares rents, the median rent around various counties in California versus the median full-time hourly earnings. And if you look at places like Kern County, where the rent is much lower, and you see what I would call the prevailing wage. So in a lot of Central Valley inland communities, you're going to be raising the minimum wage proportionally much larger. And one of the competitive advantages that they have are low wages. They also have lower costs of living, principally reflected in housing. So my concern is that many Central Valley communities, Inland Empire, other non-metro coastal portions of the state are going to face a competitive disadvantage, and there may be the risk that some of those jobs might go out of state. There might be a greater substitution of technology for labor. Going to a fast food restaurant today, and I had a trip back from Las Vegas with my family back in the spring, and we stopped at a Carl Jr.'s, and there was only one person working at the counter. I think you're going to see additional substitution. Overall, though, it's not going to cause massive job loss. I think it will change a mix in the jobs. I think you're going to also see, as you raise workers' wages that are subject to the minimum wage, there's going to be wage compression against the lower middle, and I think we're going to see some substitution of more skilled labor for less skilled labor. I do think that's going to happen. So I would have preferred to have had the minimum wage set around the state by county, or at least by metro, the counties within the metro. What we have is an experimental laboratory. We're going to find out. The good news is we're not raising the minimum wage to $15 January 1st, 2017. It phases in. But I think we have to be honest and understand there are going to be some dislocations that occur. That's my opinion.
Rusty, you wanted to weigh in. Why wouldn't it be better to have the model that's happening in Oregon, where it's a tiered minimum wage, and rural areas will have a lower minimum wage than urban areas?
Well, I think in some ways that's what we have in California. Because you have cities in the Bay Area, because you have the city of Los Angeles and the county of Los Angeles and a number of other cities that have stepped forward and increased their wage already and are on a little bit of a faster track than the statewide minimum wage, you do have some version of a regional differential that has taken place. Now, and I believe we did take a thoughtful approach in the decision to raise the minimum wage, because it isn't $15 overnight, when frankly, workers need $15 and then some today. The moderator's own story says that it takes $33 an hour to afford an average apartment in the city, in the city of LA. $15 an hour doesn't get you that. Obviously, there are multiple individuals likely in a single family unit. But I do think we have some version of a regional differential today.
But Ken, what do you think is going to happen in places like some of the places in this chart, Kern County, Stockton, San Bernardino? Because it's one thing to have a $15 minimum wage there versus San Francisco or Santa Monica or even LA.
Well, I think Rusty touched on the key point here. Is this is phasing in over a very slow timeline. For small businesses, we won't hit $15 an hour till 2023. Indexing starts in 2024. So that's a long adjustment period, but also means in terms of the real value of the minimum wage is actually much lower than $15 would be today. When we look at what are those impacts in different areas, I think it's important to step back and say, well, how do businesses absorb a higher minimum wage? What do we know from the literature? And there's a lot of good research that's been done over the last 20 years that's found that minimum wage increases of the size we've seen in the United States today have not had a measurable effect on employment and have really raised wages. I think Dale Bellman and Paul Wolfson did a whole book on this, and their conclusion was minimum wage laws have their intended effect. They improve incomes of low-wage workers without a measurable effect on employment. When we were asked to do the study for the city of Los Angeles, the big question we had was, okay, we know what the literature says up to where minimum wages have been done, but what happens if you go higher?
Right.
And so, slide 14, when we did that study, we looked at let's take all of the arguments very seriously on both sides. So in terms of the issues that Russ raised, in looking at, all right, you're going to have some amount of automation and productivity growth, and what do we know from the literature about how much that's going to be? We do know that when wages go up, there's lower worker turnover, workers stay on the job longer, that saves firms money. We estimate that absorbs about 20% of the cost. And then the rest comes out in higher prices, generally is passed on to the consumers. There's good research literature on this. When LADC did a survey of businesses in LA, they responded in the same way, along with what we've seen in the literature. But it's important to note just how small that is. For California, on this $15 by 2023, what that means for overall prices of goods and services in the state is a 0.6% increase over that entire phase-in period. It's bigger in restaurants. It's about 5%, 5.1% increase. So what's the difference there in Fresno? It's about a 1.2% total increase in cost of goods and services, and a little over 6% in restaurants. We are not talking about a massive change in overall prices. These are small. But we know if you raise the price, then that's going to have a downward effect on demand. And so all of those things you would expect to have a negative impact on employment. Then the other side, which the minimum wage supporters raised, was you put more money in low-wage workers' pockets, they spend that money. They spend it in the local economy, and that has a multiplier effect, and that creates jobs. And so we put all of these effects together in a model, and we said, so what does it mean when you look at all those countervailing effects? And what we found is you do see the real impact on workers' wages in terms of earnings going up, but the other effects largely balance out. And so in terms of overall state of California, we expect no measurable effect on employment. Even in Fresno, we don't expect much measurable effect on employment. Now, that doesn't mean you won't have some people lose jobs and other people gain jobs, or some businesses go out and other businesses come in. We have a dynamic economy, but in terms of on net, we don't anticipate any real change there. So overall, it does bring us back to the idea that minimum wage laws really do have their intended effect. And there are certain areas that we will need to watch as this goes into place, and look at what policies or other things we need to do to make it work. Because it's going in over a long period of time, we have time to watch it. We have time to see, is something happening in some areas or industries which we hadn't anticipated? One of the ones we're looking at closely are some of the human service industries and childcare. And what are the other policies we need to do to make sure the funding and support or training or other things are there to make those everyone succeed in that new policy environment?
Well, we have time to watch it, but it's not like it's going to go away. It's already being phased in. Some of the people who oppose minimum wage said, why don't we see what happens with a certain increase and then raise it to 15 later? And I think a lot of most economists do agree there's not an effect on employment, but this big an increase has never been done in a state as large as California.
I worked for a man by the name of Larry Klein at Wharton Econometrics at University of Pennsylvania for many years, father of macroeconometric model building. And I remember something he told me: there's lies, damn lies, and models that lie. And I'm not saying your model lies, I'm saying that it's hard to set the counterfactual future. Now, I was trained as a regional economist. I'm aware of all the literature on this. One of my biggest critiques, there really hasn't been much work done on the counterfactual in terms of how it affects a regional economy, both within a metro area, within a state. There's been some cross-border work done on the East Coast when minimum wages were at different levels and looking at what happened, and on net there wasn't much effect. But I'm not so sure that we can rely on those studies, because this increase in the minimum wage is kind of out of historic bounds, especially in inland California, relative to the prevailing wage. So my point is, my sense is there's going to be more businesses that decide not to expand here, that the minimum wage going up this high, while that by itself isn't enough, but because of all the onerous regulatory and CEQA, all the other things that they have to deal with, that it's one more issue that makes the business climate perception more negative in California, and I fear that some firms are going to choose to expand elsewhere, not necessarily move, They'll take logistics back office operations. So you look at Kern County or the Inland Empire, kind of logistics capital of the country, and there are going to be a lot more people that are making that $15 wage. That's a good thing. But if companies can move across the border into Nevada or Arizona, they might just decide to do that. And I'm not sure that this takes all that into account.
And Amazon is just opened more warehouses in the Inland Empire. The argument you hear most of the times is that they're already here. It's hard for most businesses to pack up and leave, and a lot of the most affected places are restaurants, which have to be in a particular community. Which types of businesses do you see being most affected in terms of not expanding or not coming here?
Well, certainly the logistics industry is one, and they build warehouses, but they're still fairly mobile. The other thing that it's kind of hard to capture is if you look at the travel and tourism industry, hotels, restaurants. California has a large travel and tourism-based industry, leisure, and when people are making decisions on where they're going to go on vacation, where they're going to hold business conventions, I think at the margin, they might say, that trip to Disneyland is going to cost more, maybe I ought to go to Disney World. And so those things happen over time, they don't happen overnight, but it's possible that we could lose some competitive advantage in the leisure industry, for example.
We do have some good examples here. The hotels near the airport moved up to a $13 an hour wage, not quite a decade ago, but some time ago now. And what we saw was that happened right in 2007, 2008, we have our crash. And by 2009, the revenue per room at those airport hotels was up. Overall profits was up. And were up, and they hadn't seen a decline in employment at those hotels. So even in the depths of our recession, that $13 wage was those local airport hotels were able to sustain that wage and grow and make more money in that period. So we have a little, I think, as Ross is saying, we're going to find out some more stuff as we go, but we do have a fair amount of good regional examples about how low-wage industries have survived and thrived, even dealing with a higher wage. And I think for us, we try and think about, focusing on how people are really able to live in the region. We want to build a sustainable economy that's growing from the ground up and letting all folks really, as our economy grows and expands, which California is doing, and it's very exciting. I like to be able to boast about how we are the 6th largest economy in the world, and that continues to grow despite what's sometimes viewed as a heavy amount of regulation. That hasn't so far hurt our state's growth. So I think we have a lot of good examples, and I think for many of us, I think we all agree that if somebody's working full-time, they simply shouldn't be living in poverty. It's just not right. It's not the kind of country I think any of us want to have. And so raising that floor to a legitimate level is also, in addition to being, I think, economically viable, the right thing to do.
Well, Rusty, you mentioned the story I did that showed that you would actually need $33 to an hour or to earn $68,000 a year to afford the average apartment in LA County. So in that sense, 15 is a lot more than 10, but it's still about half of what you would need to afford housing here. So I guess, what do we do about that?
Well, we've got some stuff on the ballot.
Measure JJJ.
Both Measure JJJ, which I'll let Rusty talk about, and also HHH, which I think is something that we really need to see happen. But I think there's a lot of shared agreement about the need to build more housing at all levels of affordability, to really address not new folks moving into our region, but just our own kids. I mean, when I think about my children, makes me nervous to imagine. I mean, I love them. I'm not sure I want to live with them till they're 30. And the only way to address that, I think, is for us to get really smart about how we're building more housing in the region, how we're looking at smart ways to enable more development that don't destroy single-family home neighborhoods, but that really take advantage of density where it exists. We're going to have to build a lot more housing to address the need, and we're going to have to ensure that we're building affordable housing as well.
Rusty, do you want to weigh in on that, how this fits into housing? Because if everyone is making a little bit more, presumably it becomes even more people who kind of who are fighting for the same pool of places to live.
Well, certainly during the minimum wage debate, the issue of housing was as prominent as wages. And so we knew that you couldn't address a wage issue and not talk about an affordable housing issue at the same time. In the city of LA, you need, I think the numbers are 80,000 housing units. Southern California, you need 500,000 housing units. And so it's not in the city of LA, just using that as an example, it's not as if there isn't housing that's being permitted or housing that's being built. In fact, in some sectors of the city, there's a boom that's going on in connection with housing construction. Unfortunately, it's either in like the higher moderate income levels or luxury. The fact that in 2013, which is the last year we have the data for, there was 157% of the luxury housing that was required in the city was constructed, and yet only 37% of the affordable housing that was required was constructed. And so the measure that housing advocates and construction workers and the Federation have stepped forward and put on the ballot simply calls on developers to include affordable housing as part of their project and to give preference to local workers to construct the project if in fact they go to the city and request a zoning change that allows them to construct that project. If the city grants a zoning change that ultimately increases the value of that land, of that project, we believe that the community should get something for that. We argue that that's in some housing you can actually afford and a job you can provide for yourself and for your family on. And so is one measure the end-all be-all? Absolutely not. There are many other issues connected to housing that need to be addressed. There needs to be a dedicated funding stream, and I know Proposition HHH, the homelessness bond, does some portion of that. But there's a planning process, planning capacity that needs to be addressed. The community plans need to be updated. There are a number of issues that surround the challenges that there are in the construction of housing in Southern California in particular.
We're simply not producing enough housing in the state, and we can go into the various reasons. Some of them are regulatory, the inability to plan in advance. So, for example, I know lots of developers and builders, and if you talk to them, one of their biggest frustrations, they operate west of the Mississippi, they also do work in Texas, is the inconsistency with which the approvals are granted at different times. And one project, it gets approved fairly quickly. The next one, it's 3 times as long. And it's that variability in being able to know this is going to take 6 months, this is going to take another year. And that's something we need to deal with in CEQA. I mean, there's a whole private session addressing that. That needs to be addressed. The bottom line is that if a developer can only make money building high-end housing, guess what's going to happen? They're going to build high-end housing. And we need to come up with different approaches and at least have some test cases where we grant expedited permitting if, for example, you agree to allocate a certain percentage of the new units to affordable housing. They've been working on this in San Francisco. Mayor Lee, got elected. He was a housing advocate. And of course, he's had protests against him and stopping building new construction there, but I think they're going to work that out.
Well, there are other panels on CEQA and also affordable housing, so we don't want to go too far down that road.
Agreed.
So let's bring it back to a living wage. And I know one of the things, Ross, that you have studied is more market-based solutions. And you also wrote a paper on the importance of career technical education. You see that as probably a better tool, if I'm not mistaken, than a minimum wage?
I think in the long term, it's a better tool. It doesn't mean we don't need to address the low-wage worker today through raising minimum wages. We do. But we need to have a long-term strategy for where we're going to end up, because we don't necessarily want to be creating a higher proportion of minimum wage jobs. We want to move people up the ladder. So I've done a lot of work in human capital, most of it at the higher end, but I've been doing more work below the 4-year degree level, so associate degrees, certification programs. If I could have slide 2 just to touch on this. We should have put associate degrees in this graph as well, but this is based on a major study we did about 3 years ago, and then we've been updating it. The slide 2 shows you that basically if you add 1 year of educational attainment beyond high school, so 1 year at community college, you increase real GDP per capita of a metro area by over 17%. And that's not just for those workers, that's for everyone around them. So if you look at slide 3, it gives you a sense of by degree, what are the median weekly earnings and the unemployment rate for 2014. Of course, no surprise there, the higher the educational attainment, the higher the wages. But slide 4 tries to show you the job openings of the future in California over the next 10 years, 9 years. 30% of those job openings are going to require some college or an associate degree. And here, I think, lies the opportunity if you look at slide 5. This is from the salary survey from the California community colleges, and it looks at what someone's wages were prior to going into the program, and then what they would be 5 years later. So after you've gone through and received kind of an AA general education, after 5 years, you make a little bit over $38,000 in California. But these career technical education fields, things that we might have called vocational education in the past, career technical education, $66,000 5 years after graduating. And we're simply not funding programs in career technical education at the level that we should be. We need to get employers more involved and helping create the curriculum that leads to training for the jobs that they require. This is where we've been asleep at the switch. Over the long term, if we really want to reduce income inequality and provide someone with a good job that you can have a family, this is the way to do it. And we need to focus more on this because I think we've kind of lost our way in a sense in that everybody doesn't need to go into a 4-year degree program. There are good jobs out there, but we kind of made what we used to call vocational education a dirty word. And today it's career technical education. There are lots of opportunities. We just had a private session discussing these opportunities in the last slot. And there are jobs, aerospace jobs, electricians that make over $100,000 a year with a 2-year associate degree program. And I think here's the win-win in working with unions and employers and the community colleges. This is the way we can really help address this low-wage worker and really seeing that people have a living wage.
And we have a lot of lawmakers here at the conference. So what is the best way to have more career technical education? Is it just more funding for
It's
these
not
programs?
just more funding. My opinion is somewhat controversial, not the first time that it is. But I think we need to have regional clusters of industries around the state, and it's not one size fits all. So if you're in the Bay Area, the Central Valley, or LA or Orange County, employers have different needs. And I think those industry groupings, those employers, need to be actively engaged with the community colleges, with the workforce investment boards, in helping design curriculum so that when people graduate with these certifications, and not just an associate degree, you can get a certification that they're directly employable. They might have had an apprenticeship while they were doing that and getting paid during that apprenticeship. Therefore, they'll stick with it. And I think this is part of the pathway forward. It's not the whole solution, but I think it's a big piece of it.
We have a good example of that here. You know, our utility for the city of Los Angeles, the Department of Water and Power, has over 40% of its workforce at or near retirement age, and that average salary falls right around your $66,000. So you've got this graying workforce, a desperate need to train, and so the utility led a project that we were a part of, and the union that represents workers in the utility, to create a paid apprenticeship leading into permanent positions within the utility, where they're getting a certification, and the utility uses this program to do their energy efficiency retrofits for low-income homeowners. Now they're adding in solar as well, so folks are both getting certified to do energy efficiency work, getting certified now to do solar installation. So these are definitely skills that they can carry to other jobs, but we actually really need them to move into permanent positions within the utility to replace what is a graying workforce. So I think there's some good examples, and I know the Fed has worked on a similar program to really focus in on, because we agree, we think this is a really key piece of the puzzle.
But Ken, what do you think of this? I mean, how much is the wage issue solved by giving workers more education and more skills?
Education's important. There's no question people who have more education up to a certain point earn more than people who have less education. We should be doing better. And career tech is an important place to invest, and I think Ross made the point, and Roxana, that when we do, it has to be connected to real jobs. There's been a lot of work that's put a lot of money into various kinds of training where people come out with certifications, but they don't match the skill needs. Medical assistance is a big one in this state, where we have private colleges, for-profit, doing training medical assistants who the hospitals won't hire because they don't have the skill sets that they actually need. And there's been Kaiser's doing a good program with the union to do training so people actually get the right skill set. So all that's important. But I think it's also important to note, if we, look back at that earlier slide, 30% of the jobs being created don't require more education. We need to make sure those jobs are also decent jobs that people can survive and support their families on. And we've seen this cascading down because of the hollowing out of middle class or middle skilled jobs, middle wage jobs over the last 10, 20 years. We've seen a cascading down where people who have more education are taking lower paid jobs, and then those people can't find jobs, and that pushes people down. So we can't educate our way out of the problem. Education is an important part of the solution, but the solution will also require things that directly give workers more bargaining power. That means things like raising the floor like minimum wage. It means things like nationally dealing with the problems in our labor law that make it difficult for workers to organize and bargain collectively. It means things like maintaining or having monetary and fiscal policy that's designed towards tightening up the labor market, so we put pressure on wages and we can get those up. There's a whole series of things that need to be done. We also should be thinking a lot more about, now that we've got the floor up around, like was done in LA with the hotels, specific industries where there are opportunities to move wages up in those industries. And we look at around the world, in Europe, Australia, elsewhere, a lot of industry-based wage setting. And I think those are some of the places that we need to go. Because when we do that, that also pushes productivity, it also pushes growth, and it also helps dynamize the economy. One thing that there used to be, when I was in school, everyone talked about this trade-off between growth and equality. You could have one and not the other. And now there's this great recognition that inequality stifles growth. And that's both true because we have a consumer economy and we need people with the money in their pockets to spend it to be the basis for building that economy. It's also true because you lead to political capture, which creates rules of the game, which make it harder for people to go forward and for the economy to move. And so this is important for a host of reasons. Just the last thing I'll add when we think about the wage side of it is more and more evidence is coming out on the downstream effects of what it means for people to grow up in poverty or to grow up without resources. So a couple of studies now have been done on minimum wage that found an immediate effect on children's birth weights and on infant mortality. We know more and more about the effects of stress on early life of kids in terms of what that means for educational attainment and for their future job prospects. And there's more and more, there's been good experiments showing when families have more money, that reduces that stress and you see those impacts downstream. And so raising the minimum wage is part of that. EITC also can have those same kinds of positive effects, but we really need to be tackling this in both places.
Rusty, do you want to weigh in on that, the issue of education skills versus minimum wage?
Look, I certainly think when you talk about raising the minimum wage, the goal is not to exclusively focus on low-wage workers. The challenge that was before us was you had, in the city of LA, you had 750,000 people making less than $15 an hour. Statewide, you had 6 million people. Those numbers are too large to simply ignore. But certainly focusing on career technical education, Ross and I agree on this.
There's a first.
There's a room for everything, right?
That's right.
But I do think that this is something that certainly the labor movement has been active on for a long, long period of time, long before it was trendy. You look at the construction trades, the term apprenticeship program, they feel a sense of ownership over that because in many ways that's where those crafts originated, was through the apprenticeship programs. Roxana spoke about a program that the Fed has. We took 30 individuals that were previously incarcerated and recently released. We have a 12-week program, 3 weeks of soft life skills, 8 weeks of multi-craft curriculum with LA Trade Tech, and then guaranteed them a slot in the apprenticeship program if they completed the program. Of the 30, 20 graduated this past Friday, and all 20 have been placed on a job site within an apprenticeship program, not in a low-wage job, but on a path to a career that will put them in that $65,000, $50,000 range. Being an electrician, being a sheet metal worker, being a plumber, a laborer, whatever it might be. We can take that model and apply it to different industries. We can apply it to different demographics and constituencies. We talk about our corrections system in California. In the 50s and 60s, it was regarded as rehabilitation before corrections, right? And had some of the best career technical education programs in the country. And yet through budget cuts and differences of opinions and values, that got cut back. I think we need to go back to that. But the important thing is that there's a job on the back end, which has already been said.
Well, we're going to take questions in just a minute, but I also wanted to just ask you briefly, because this, as we said, moved from the Northwest here very quickly. New York State is also enacting a $15 minimum wage. But this has been an issue in the presidential election, which is, of course, 2 weeks from today. Hillary Clinton has said she supports a local $15 minimum wage, not necessarily a national one. She prefers a $12 national minimum wage. Donald Trump has been a little bit all over the place on this. He at one point said he did support a $10 national minimum wage. But what are you?
Would you expect anything different from him? To be over the place?
He's been on the different sides of a lot of issues.
Yeah, but he's got all.
We almost got through this panel without talking about the election. But
right.
What are the odds that you think, given how quickly it's spread in these blue states, that there will be a big increase in the national minimum wage to say $12?
Well, in 2014. You actually saw the minimum wage go up in several red states. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Arkansas, Alaska, several others. So I do think that the time has come for the federal government to step forward and take action on this. Our hope is that we have a president who will lead that fight.
Well, let's open it up to questions for our panel. Hopefully skeptical questions.
Is there a microphone?
Yeah, we should have. Someone will come around to you with a microphone. Yes, sir. You're in the aisle. Wait
get a
for the
microphone right
to
down here.
Come to you.
It's hard
Thank
to
you.
see.
And I want to salute you guys. I think you gave a very reasoned and very structured argument to this very complicated issue that has ramifications beyond economics into social strata, et cetera. But the question is this. In looking at, and I want to direct it more to Ross instead of Rusty, given that the marginal propensity to consume for these consumers that are looking for an increase in the minimum wage is like 100%, would that not benefit those in the upper income levels who are going to be the businesses that sell goods and services to those whose income will increase, leading to an increase in those whose wages have already increased 47% over the last few decades? In other words, if you pay me more money and I'm a consumer, and chances are I'm buying my cell phone service, I'm paying for my rent, and I'm paying for everything from individuals who are already in the upper 20 or 10% wage bracket, would they not get a raise as well? Thank you.
Fair question. I think Ken kind of went through the positives and the negatives. There are offsets. Certainly, you're going to have higher income, which leads to greater purchasing power. That will offset some of that. But there's also something that I learned in graduate school called the marginal revenue product of labor. And that's at the margin, what does an additional worker add to your revenue? And in many cases, I think we're going to find, for example, in the Central Valley, that we're going to find that tipping point is hit, and it is going to have some negative consequences. Is it going to be catastrophic? No. I will acknowledge there are offsets, but businesses make these decisions. I've talked to many CEOs and other business leaders, and they're already developing the strategy for what they're going to do when this is fully phased in by 2021. And I hate to tell you, they're all not going to stay here. So there are going to be real consequences, but we have to be honest in that, and as I said, I acknowledge there are some offsets. The higher incomes, the higher wages lead to aggregate demand, and some businesses will benefit from that. It's a question of what is the net effect on balance.
And we do hear that a lot, and we heard that during the debate, that businesses would pack up and leave. And we heard
I don't think they're going to pack up and leave. What generally happens is whatever back office operations, whatever they can, when they're looking to expand, they will expand outside the state and choose not to expand here. It's not there's going to be a mass relocation. At the margin, some companies will decide to move some operations elsewhere. Is that a huge effect? I don't think so, but it is a real effect, in my opinion.
All right, next question, please. Yes, sir, in the back. Wait for the microphone to come to you.
Hi. A bunch of municipalities did adopt their own minimum wage ordinance before the state adopted their own. And I'm from Pasadena. We did adopt our own minimum wage ordinance. And we're getting some pressure now from the business community to kind of conform to the state minimum wage, especially for organizations that operate in multiple jurisdictions. Can you talk about the pros and cons of maybe synchronizing or allowing kind of local jurisdictions to have their own wage ordinances in place? There's obviously complexity around enforcement because it's now a local ordinance. So we're hearing this bubble back up, and I'd love to get the perspective from this group.
Pasadena is synchronized with the city of Los Angeles and Santa Monica. What we're seeing right now, and one of the most interesting moves going on is in Santa Clara County. The Cities Association of Santa Clara County all agreed on a common minimum wage that they would reach $15 an hour by 2019, and that have been passing it city by city, so effectively creating a regional wage there, given the high cost of living in Santa Clara County that is higher than what we have in the state. Obviously, San Francisco was 15 by 2018, going a little bit quicker. So I think we are seeing some those regional efforts being done, and it's smart to try to coordinate that as much as possible. So to the degree you have, like in Santa Clara, we have more of the cities conforming, and in LA there is an LA standard, which makes sense for cities to conform to, given the higher costs than the state overall.
I do think the enforcement question is a really important one, though. A city like Pasadena or Long Beach is inevitably going to have fewer resources to deal with enforcement than, say, the city of Los Angeles or the county of Los Angeles. And what's exciting is that we have a really robust enforcement mechanism within the city's Bureau of Contract Administration, which has many, many years of enforcing similar kinds of policies, although certainly the scale is big. And likewise, Brian Steiger at the county runs a similar office. And what the county and LA offices are trying to think about is how can they help smaller cities like Pasadena, Long Beach, manage some of the costs of that enforcement and help ensure a kind of more unified enforcement throughout the region. Using the sort of economies of scale that come when most places in a region are moving forward with roughly the same policy. So I think that's going to be really important for Pasadena going forward, is to think about how we can, as a region, share some of those costs of enforcement.
And what's the main enforcement issue? Businesses paying less than the minimum wage?
Well, there are a handful of industries where wage theft is higher, like the restaurant industry. I think, frankly, the vast majority of businesses obey the law across the board and will obey the law in terms of minimum wage. But there are going to be a handful of industries more focused in low-wage service sector arenas where there's a bigger challenge. And so in that sense, I think we solve a lot of the problem with education for businesses about what the law is and how to comply. There will be some cost to the city around enforcement, and so thinking about that regionally, I think, is a smarter way to help smaller cities.
Other questions? Yes, over here.
Hi, thank you. I wonder if you could address the issue of job entrance, because as we're increasing the wage for low-skilled, low-requirement, educational requirement jobs, we're going to replace those jobs with people who are higher skilled. As Ken mentioned, they're being forced down into lower skilled jobs. So that means job entrance, such as high school students or my children, are going to have more difficulty in getting the job skills that they can gain in their first jobs.
Well, this has been one of my talking points. I didn't get into it. One of my concerns. And as Ken pointed out, there are fewer of the employees that are subject to the minimum wage, fewer of them are youth today than they've been in the past. That's all true. But when a company looks at, when I'm going to hire the marginal worker, do I want to hire someone with low skills that doesn't have an attachment to the labor market yet? They don't know what it's like to show up to work on time and how important that is. And will employers give them the chance at that first job? Because you need to have attachment to the labor force in order to get the training to move up. And if those youth do not get into the labor force early enough, they're affected for years to come, decades to come. There's a lot of evidence to support that. Let me just get in one other point I wanted to raise with regard to the minimum wage and some of the counterfactual, counterintuitive things. Companies that are paying benefits right already that now have to pay a higher minimum wage, it's possible, I don't want to see it happen, but it's possible that some of those employers may not choose to pay as many of those benefits as they did before. And there's no differential in the minimum wage as it's applied to recognize that. So I think that's a concern as well.
Time for about one more question. Sir, yes, over here.
When you look at the base of California agriculture, which is a real segment of California income, you look at the double and triple whammies of the reduction in work hours and the increases in wage, and then the shortage of people, workforce, true workforce. How do you see this affecting the tipping points of some of these Central Valley communities and the coastal communities where there's a good 20-30% of the proportional income for the cities and governments come from it.
Great question. Ken, do you want to?
I'd say that this varies really heavily by crop. And we could see some crop substitution. For example, in Napa, where they're having trouble getting workers because it's too hard, it's too expensive, there were labor brokers up there were really happy to see the wage move towards $15 an hour because they think then they can get workers into those areas. You have, almonds, of course, huge export crop, but it is heavily automated, and so the labor share of cost is extremely low. You've got something like strawberries where the labor share of cost is high, but because of seasonality, when you can import from Mexico is a different part of the season than when they're grown here, so you're not likely to see a big effect there either. So I think on all of these things, it really is important in the agriculture sector to kind of look at it crop by crop and understand where that's going. There's some research going on in that area, but we could see some crop substitution towards less labor intensive.
If I can just add, when the governor signed the minimum wage increase, he said that if this was just an economic conversation, you wouldn't need minimum wages. But there was a moral imperative that was connected to the minimum wage. And so this argument really came up again when talking about the agriculture industry and 400,000 primarily immigrants that were picking the food that ends up on our tables. And so I think everyone recognizes that the potential impact of the agricultural industry is something that needs to be watched and monitored, not only with the increase in the minimum wage, but the application of the 8-hour day to an industry.
I wish I had an 8-hour day.
Which was, if you want to be in the fields working 8 hours,
No,
I'm sure
I don't want
they got
that.
a job for
And they
you.
wouldn't want me either.
So I think as we talk about this conversation is not exclusively, but it's really focused on the economic arguments and the economic impact. But there's a moral imperative to having 6 million workers be able to have an opportunity to provide for themselves and their families, or nearly 500,000 folks in our fields that are a part of our state and part of our community. So.
All right. Well, on that note, we will thank our panel very much and thank all of you for coming.
Thank you.